Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. It's so great to see you all on this beautiful evening as we're all just kind of gathering together. This particular webinar is geared for the 180 post-COVID framework for church revitalization. And so just want to thank you for being on the webinar with me. And we have a lot of different insights to go over, but I would love to know where you're tuning in from. And so go on and throw that up in the chat. And if you do that, it kind of seems strange. I just want to ask you this question. As you go into summer, what's your favorite thing to do? I would love to just know, to kind of kick off the summer, what do you do? We all kind of have these quirks. So for me, to kick off my summer, I go and I get a six pack of this soda. It's kind of like a bubble water soda called Zevia. I know it kind of sounds like a spy op on NCIS, but it's really a stevia type soda, and it's a root beer. And it's just this ritual thing that I do, that I just go get one of those and I just drink this root beer, and I'm like, all right, it's time to start summer. And so for me, I mainly drink water. And but for this particular time, as I'm entering into summer, which I'll have here probably in a couple of days, I'll have my Zevia to kind of kick off the summer. And I just want to know, what do you guys do? Do you have any quirks? I just want to know a little bit about you, where you're tuning in from, and maybe what's your favorite drink, beverage, non-alcoholic. Okay, we're Baptists here. But just let me know kind of what you do, because what that does for me, it kind of resets the vitality in my heart for the summer. So it's a new season. It's time to do something kind of brand new. And it's a really quirky thing I do, but it's awesome. Well, anyway, as you're putting those things up in the chat, post-COVID life had some lasting changes. And I think for most of it, we're kind of done. But I really believe what we're feeling now is the kind of the residue of what we've all been through. And that residue has actually left some lasting changes in us personally, and also in our churches. And it's made a real impact in our community, in their behavior and just how they respond to the local church, how they respond to revitalization and all of that. And so in this webinar, we're going to discuss the strategies for thriving in the current ministry environment by encouraging creative thinking, growing our influence, and revitalizing our community. And so after this webinar, we're going to follow up with some free resources for you. I have a 30-day guide to revitalization I want to give to you absolutely free, and then give you kind of an in on the Vitality Vault, which has over $500 worth of free resources for you. And then we're going to also talk about some different opportunities for you to jump in on in the fall. So you should have received a handout, and that handout should be in the chat. So go on and pull that out. And we're going to take a dive here in the next couple of moments together on looking at the shifts to consider for the 180 framework. So as you think of 180, many people probably think of speeding in their car, maybe doing a 180 on your bike, but 180 by definition is to basically go in the opposite direction, right? In life, we can tend to think, okay, well, we can also apply to going in a different opinion, a different decision, a different direction, just go in the opposite way that we were originally going. And so when it comes down to doing a 180, when it comes to the local church, we have to think differently about our future and where God is taking us. And I believe with all my heart, these shifts that we are experiencing are already in place, and they will be in place for the future. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go through some of these, and you're going to take some notes, and I'm going to give you some thought-provoking questions to consider for you as the pastor, you and your team, and your local church within your context. So this can go across the board. Your church doesn't need to be any particular size. This is just the basic framework of making the shifts needed for the future. And so if you're taking notes, the first shift that we're going to look at is rethinking our finish and influence. Rethinking our finish and influence. So this particular shift, picture yourself in a Porsche or a Lamborghini making a shift, a hard shift into another gear. So this first shift is really shifting from dependence to interdependence, shifting from dependence to interdependence. And so this is kind of what I'm calling the revitalization footprint that we need to start looking at. And so I'm going to ask you some questions, and you can write these questions down. These are questions you can bring to your team. These questions that I'm going to give you, you could bring to, a trusted coworker and say, hey, can we talk about these things? Because I think these need to have conversations around these questions. So the first question is in your church right now, you need to ask the question, what are we seeking to build or accomplish that will last beyond our involvement? So what are we seeking to build or accomplish that will last beyond our involvement? So if you knew that your church would cease to exist in the next 10 or 20 years, what would you do differently? Think about going to the doctor and the doctor tells you, hey, you've got 6 months to live. You have 1 year to live. You have 3 years to live. You would make some drastic changes and cut things out to make things very clear. And so this is what we're talking about. We're talking about creating clarity around the finish line, around the end game. And so this is very, very important. And so some of the ways that we can make this shift is that we want to influence others to lead successfully. So as we progress, we need more voices to prod the people around us. Because right now in the local church, we are fighting against consumerism and the growth of self is growing. And so we've got to be cognitive of that. And we have to have more people it being more interdependent on each other rather than just maybe the pastor just being the only voice in the room. And so we have to kind of start thinking about team, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. But make sure that your voice, pastor, is not the only voice communicating the vision, right? In this time, in COVID, post-COVID culture, we have to build vision carriers, meaning that the days of the sage on the stage are over. People are not just going to listen to one person anymore with one voice, with one opinion. They're actually looking for teamwork. They're looking for a team of people that believe the same vision as the pastor believes, that has more of the concept of carrying the vision out into the streets, not just into the building. And so this is really, really important. And so as you're building this out in the next 10 to 20 years and you're thinking about the shift, a really important thing for us to consider is developing a succession plan. Now, this sounds like probably premature. Maybe you're in your 20s or your 30s and you're like, man, that's a long time away. Well, actually, it's not. It will go faster than you think. And the church that actually has a written succession plan in place is going to leave the church in a way better place than when they found it. And so this is really about being proactive. And I tell pastors all the time, like, God might give you a vision, but that vision might not be for you to carry all the way through. You know, when you think about Abraham, Abraham never got to see the nation. He was only told that a nation would be built through him. Moses never got to walk in the new land. He only saw it from a distance. And so this concept, God might be using you for a season, but sometimes in our ministries, you know, we tend to overlook the responsibilities that we have with obeying the vision and being able to carry it out. And so when you study Moses, you see that God tells Joshua to continue on with the things he taught Moses. And so it goes from generation to generation. And so when you're taking steps in under point one in these notes, this is pretty simple. So I'm just going to give you some things to think about. I want you to look at your current church's operations and programs. Like, how are you operating right now? Are you still trying to get back to 2019? Are you still trying to get back to even 1950? Those days are long gone, and you've got to make a shift to start thinking about the future. So what I want you to do is maybe identify the things that depend on just you alone as the pastor. And then I want you to ask a question: what can you immediately give away? Like, you don't need to carry that anymore. You can hand that over and trust it to somebody on your team. And hand off the authority with permission to allow people to lead. That's one way you can do the shift. Another way is just to start delegating little by little over time to other leaders. You want to train up leaders. And listen, the leaders are not going to be at 100%. As pastors, we can kind of get into this guilt trip where we've got to have this high functioning leader. I mean, if you look at the disciples, I don't think any of them were high functioning. I think many of them did more messing up than good, but finally they figured it out after time. You know, I always teach people leadership doesn't happen when you're present. It happens when you're not there and when you've trained others. And when you're not there, in your absence, if you've done the right training, people will step up and lead for you. And that's really a good test in your leadership. And so with that, I want you to kind of identify 1 to 2 leaders that you can pour into through leadership development and create a plan to help them lead the revitalization efforts with you. And then start creating a succession plan, like saying, hey, what if I was to get hit by a bus or hit by a bird or an eagle or drop dead of a heart attack? Like, what are we going to do? We need to have something in place so that we can function. And I know from statistics, and it seems that it's getting worse, but pastors have been hanging on way too long. Matter of fact, the stats tell us that they're hanging on way too long, to the point where we actually have a leadership deficit in our country, because there's not enough room for people to step in, because people are not passing things off appropriately. And so I don't want that to be you. I don't want you to be hanging on with a grip knuckle and knuckles turning white. I want you to be able to release what you're doing with care and with vision and with a blessing, and have everything in order. So that's shift number one. Shift number two is rethinking our purpose. Rethinking our purpose. So this shift is from shifting from insignificance to significance, from insignificance to significance. So I want to ask you some questions about your church. So here's question number one. Why do you do what you do? Why do you do what you do? Like, what's your purpose? If I was to walk into your church, would I be able to say, oh, this is what this church is about? Or would I be trying to seek out the answer? Why the church, why you're pastoring your church, and what are you actually producing? We want to be a church that produces 30, 60, 100-fold return, and not have consumers in our church. And so God's all about reproduction, right? He wants the church to reproduce. That's why in Mark 4, you see this concept of reproducing and multiplying ministries, multiplying. God wants multiplication. And so these are really key things that we have to start thinking about. And so these are issues that I think many churches are not doing in New England. I know, from the churches that I work with in particular, it's really hard to let go of things, because we've always done it the way it's always been done. And so sometimes we have to say, you know what, it's not working, and have that hard conversation and say, okay, what can we do differently? And so you have to challenge people to shift from maybe consumer thinking to a contributor thinking. Like, when a new person walks into your church, how can you get them to step into the church immediately and be a contributor? Not just giving money, but just giving their time, their tongue. It's sharing about your church, sharing about where they go to church. Just get them excited about the vision, and then clarifying the mission and vision. Like, what are we called to do? And it's going to be important, because I'm going to dig down into this a little bit more for an opportunity towards the end of the webinar. But you want to dig down and have clarity around what you're doing. And so you want to identify the efforts, the programs, kind of with the highest return, and make them excellent. So you don't want to just have a bunch of programs and a bunch of things going on, and they're not all functioning at excellence. You want to give your best foot forward, especially now, because people are really looking for a place to thrive. And why can't it be your church? So some steps that you can take in the shift is that you want to look at your church's programming and ask yourself the hard question: what is it actually producing? What is it actually producing? Yes, we have all these classes, but after the class, what happens? Do people just go back to their normal way of life? Or do people actually multiply out of that class? So what is the class actually producing? Is it reproducing? Is it causing growth in your church? Is there a big outcome? If there's not a big outcome, and there's not, production, and there's not this concept of reproducing, then you need to start thinking about shifting away from it, because it's just not working. The second thing is you want to look at your current mission, vision, and core values. You need to ask the question, are they working? Are they really working? I walk into churches and I'm like, well, tell me your vision. And they tell it to me, and I go, well, how's it going? They go, well, not good. I go, well, I'm saying to myself, well, it's probably not working. So you probably need to rework it. And I know it costs money to print stuff and put stuff on signs and banners, but you've got to get down to the core of it. Like, what needs to change? And do people really know like what you're about? And do they get it? Do they become a vision carrier when they walk into your church? Because I know this, people want to be part of something bigger. And, sometimes that takes coaching. Sometimes that takes having a friend to come alongside and walk with you. And one of the things I'm really excited because at the BCNE, like we are committed to you, Pastor. We're committed to your local church. Pastoring in New England is a privilege. It's a privilege. And yes, it's hard. It's hard everywhere, actually. It's just we kind of get the bad weather, right? In the winter. But it's a privilege. And it's a privilege to pastor in the least reached region in America. And so we want to come alongside you and we want to encourage you. We want to equip you. And so what we're doing is we're launching another cohort for fellowship and growth. And so this is going to be an incredible opportunity starting in September. And I'm really excited because we are going to have another catalyst, and Pastor Logan Loveday is going to be kind of leading this charge. And if you don't know about Logan, Logan pastors a 100,000 member church with 3,000 services on Sunday. No, I'm just kidding. Logan is the pastor of First Baptist Church of Marlboro, and Logan is a humble leader who really is just a great example of somebody who took a situation as a church planner, and God just did this miraculous thing, merged the church and kind of replanted it. And now it's growing and thriving. And Logan just has a heart to help pastors. And so what we're doing is that we're going to start another cohort for that. So if you find yourself like alone, you find yourself like, I don't know how to do this. And you're saying, well, my church is a mega church but neither is Logan's, neither is mine. But here's the thing, we can help you get to a certain level, and we don't want you to do it alone. We want to help you. And so if you're interested in that, and if you're interested in that, I just want you to put coaching up into the chat, and we'll take note of kind of who's saying, hey, I'm in, because we want to come alongside you and we want to help you, because we know that, you're busy. You might be a bivocational pastor, and this meeting's not going to take up a lot of time. This is 1 hour a month. And really, this is all about just connecting around other people to be encouraged. And so really, we're just looking for like 10 pastors. We have people in the pipeline right now that are interested, but we're looking for a total of 10 pastors that are just be willing to just meet once a month, just to be encouraged and encourage each other, and to just trade ideas and just kind of stay encouraged, because we know we're stronger when we're together. So go on and put coach up in the chat. Let us know if you want to be part of that, and we'll get you connected. Shift number 3 is rethinking our role in the community, rethinking our role in the community. And so this is about shifting from inward to outward thinking. The summer is a perfect time to do this. This is a time where you ask yourself the question, who are we reaching? Who are we reaching? What's your target? When I go sometimes and I talk to pastors and I say, hey, what's your target? They say, well, we want to reach everybody. Well, I appreciate that, but the reality is you're not going to reach everybody. But what is your target? You need a target so you know what to aim at. And so I want to challenge you with the simple question. We did a conference last year for the annual meeting, and the theme was, who's your neighbor? I want to ask that question again. Who is your neighbor? I want you this summer to go and find your neighbors around your church and do something that will bless them. Do something. It could be a basket. It could be just a nice thank you card for being the neighbor or whatever, just letting them know you're there. Nothing too creepy. Just go reach out. Know your neighbors around your local church. And it's really, really important, because these, believe it or not, will eventually pay big dividends once they trust you. And once they trust you, they come on board. And then all of a sudden, it starts spreading around the neighborhood, and it becomes such a powerful movement of God. So around that, I want you to think about this question. What conversations do you need to be having? Particularly about your neighborhood. What are your demographics and psychographics that shape your approach to reaching the community? Because the community is changing fast. I think about my community, and in just 7 years, it has drastically changed with just the opportunity of immigration and different languages being spoken. And so our community has changed pretty fast. And so we have to kind of shift gears. And so you need to do the same. You have to understand the unique context of your community. And you have to realize that your zip code, it's not an accident. Like, God has put you there to reach and teach people about Jesus. And so lean into that. And you want to identify the brokenness in your community and develop a strong strategy, a strong target to step into that, to meet the needs of the people around you. So here are some steps under this shift. I want you to become an expert in your community. This summer, you've got all the time in the world. I know pastors are taking off and taking breaks and all that stuff. That's fine. Become an expert in your community. I want you to identify 1 to 2 opportunities for your church to meet the community's needs, not your needs, not to get your church name out, but just to be able to step into a space and meet the community's needs. And then develop a strategy to do it over the summer, or even do it during the summer. But whatever you do, you've got to realize that God has placed you in your zip code and you have an opportunity to step into it. So I want you to step into spaces really where you do not belong at first. Influence always runs on the rails of relationships. And so when you and your people can go to reach people who are far from God, this is an incredible obstacle. But when you can accomplish this, incredible things happen. I mean, do you realize that loneliness is the highest it's ever been? And so imagine if your church can step into that loneliness, step into that hole in the community and invest and invite people to follow Jesus on the journey with you. It would be life-changing. And so I want you to kind of think about that shift and as you're going through the summer. The next shift is shift number 4. Shift number 4 is rethinking mobilization for revitalization. This is really coming down to shifting from an of mission to an on mission mindset. You know, for our church for over 10 years now, we've had this. It wasn't like we want to be a church with missions. We wanted to be a church of missions. And so there was a difference there. And so we had to make some drastic changes years ago. And I'm glad we did it because that's just the mindset. And so you're going to have to kind of shift the mindset maybe of your church to be more on mission instead of having an of mission mindset to an on mission mindset. And so the question you want to ask here is, what role does the mobilization of the current church members play? So what role does the mobilization of the current church members play in your church? Like here's an easy way to say it. Are you sending them or are you just seating them? Are you sending them or are you just seating them? They have to understand their purpose. And so it's our job as pastors to help our people figure out how they can serve God within the church context and give them the opportunities to step into that to thrive. And so how do we take the mission field concept and turn it into the mission force concept? I believe that it comes down to mobilization. And it's going to be up to us as the leaders and the pastors to say, you know what, you can do this. How can we help you get this thing done? How can we help you in your space of influence to reach more people for Jesus? And not only that, but we have to give our people permission and authority and accountability to reach others. We have to say, look, you have the same Holy Spirit I do. I commission you to go out and to reach people. Give your people the authority to go reach other people. I think a lot of people, when you ask the average church member, hey, can I do this? They'll say, oh, I got to check with the pastor first. I mean, if that's in your church, you probably want to change that. You don't want that type of culture in your church. You want people to say, you know what, I'm going to own this. This is going to be in my ministry. And pastor, I want to let you know, I'm reaching people with our church name in these circles. It could be sports circles. It could be, weightlifting, like whatever it is, just the different circles. And so challenge your people to pray for and become burdened for their community. And so just ask yourself the question, how can I help them to thrive? How can I help my people to thrive? Give them permission and authority to be on mission, where they eat, work, shop, study, and play. And so depending on your culture inside your walls, you really need to be thinking to yourself, is this a permission-based or an influence-based church? Because if you want influence, you've got to influence people to influence others. And so the churches that are all about permission, can I do? And it's always a bottleneck. Those are the churches that are going to struggle to thrive. So don't be that church. Be the church that allows people to go reach people for Jesus. And so the steps you can take here when doing the shift is that you want to make sure that you schedule prayer walks in your community. You want to have people and challenge people to reach their neighbors differently. COVID, it killed community, but now we have to work even harder to rebuild it because people have higher walls now around them to climb than ever before. We have so many cultural divisions going on right now. People have more walls up than ever before, and it's even harder. So if we can get to people's hearts faster, let's do that. Let's do whatever it takes to be able to reach people and take those walls down and show them that there's a God who loves them. Provide people with resources to invest and invite people. Make sure your church literature is just up to date. Don't give somebody like a gospel tract from like 1930 and say, hey, this is really relevant. It was relevant for my grandfather, so it's relevant for us today. Like, make sure that as you're reaching millennials, as you're reaching Gen Z and the next generation, like, make sure the materials are relevant for them, because they're looking for a place to belong and become. And so, again, why can't it be your church? You just have to make these simple shifts. And so shift number 5 is rethinking sustainable growth. Rethinking sustainable growth. So here you want to shift from addition to multiplication. Addition to multiplication. So here's the questions you need to be asking right now. What is the primary growth engine for vitality in my church? What's the primary growth engine for vitality in my church? Is it only the weekend? Because in many churches, it's just the weekend. That's the only thing that people drive everybody to, is just the weekend. And so I want to challenge you to think differently in that area. Yes, it can be the weekend, but it has to be more than just the weekend. And so that's a question I want to ask you. Then another question that I want to challenge you with is, what role and priority does programming and functionality play in our current and future systems? Now, that's a big, loaded, deep question, technical question. But what role and priority does programming and functionality play in our current and future systems? And so if things can't get done unless the doors are open in the church, there's a problem. Because I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means, but what if we have another COVID thing happen and everything kind of gets shut down? How will the church thrive again? Is it just going to do Zoom, or are we going to kind of be deployed in the streets ready to go? And so I want to shift your thinking in that area to think not so much about how, what programs you have, but how you're programming in particularly, and how are those systems going to function outside of the weekend. Another question I want to ask you is, what role and priority and resource allocations, that can be human or financial, go to Sunday weekend services? So for many people, a large part of their budget will go for the weekend. A large part of their budget will go for, hey, we got to kind of do the weekend. We're going to keep counting numbers, how many people are in the seats, that whole thing. I think you need to kind of shift from those questions. You could still monitor that stuff, but that's not going to show you necessarily health. I know for us, we've definitely shifted our metrics a while back, and I'm glad we did, because we just measure things differently. Our scorecard looks way different than it ever has. And so here's a really tough question, and I'm just gonna throw it out there. If your church did not have a gathering on the weekend, what would it accomplish during the week? If your church did not meet during the weekend, what would it be accomplishing during the week? That's the question you need to ask yourself, because this is what you need to measure. So you want to make sure you're providing training and resources for evangelism. You want to make sure you're empowering your people to go and to share their story about how Jesus changed their life. And so they bring their life-changing story into their circle of influence. And all of a sudden now you've got this missional force for your church that's going and sharing Christ with people. Focus more on what happens during the week rather than what happens on the weekend. I'm seeing a lot of patterns all across New England. I thought we were going to maybe change and kind of shift in another direction. But what I'm seeing is people are going and reverting back to what was. And that is a massive danger, because we're no longer there anymore. And you've got to think future. You have to think, and I'm going to get to the couple of reasons why you have to do that in just a moment. But steps to take under this type of shift: you have to identify the evangelism resources currently available to your church. Like, what do you need to add? I know at the BC&E, we have tons of ways to help you with evangelism. We have tons of resources that we can help you get connected to and possibly even give you. I don't want to go out on a limb, but I do know, we have stuff, and we have churches that have stuff. And so we want to come alongside it and help you, but you need to identify those resources available to your church. Another question or statement that you want to really think about is, you want to ask your church members, particularly if they feel equipped and trained to share their stories of life change. If not, you need to look for resources and training to help encourage them to share their story. One of the most powerful things about sharing your story is that nobody can argue with your story. Most people can talk about themselves easier than anything else that I've ever seen. And so when you teach people to share their story and their life change, all of a sudden it becomes something that they own because it's their story. And so if you can share and help people do that, that would be an incredible way, an incredible resource for you to do that. Another thing, you want to identify kind of the process and the resources available to new believers. When people who are coming so far from God, they know nothing about Christianity. And I'm just going to speak for our church. Like, we've probably seen the biggest influx of people who literally have no clue about church at all, no clue about God, no clue about Jesus. They're massively confused about religion. And I'm spending a lot of my time, I feel like I'm literally in Acts 17 now, not in Acts 2, but in Acts 17, explaining who God is and the basic doctrinal things that maybe even 10 years ago that we could explain. I feel like they're being lost as the Gen Z is getting older and they're walking into our church. They really don't have a clue who this God is. I mean, they don't talk about it in their schools, and they don't talk about it in their homes. And so when they come, they're perplexed about, like, whoa, what is this? And it's all new to them. And so I want to challenge you to have the resources available to help people journey, especially new believers, because I really think it's important for you to do so. Also, next shift is shift number 6. And this is rethinking the decentralization of the lead pastor. Now, don't freak out. Okay. I'm not telling you got to fire yourself. I'm just saying rethink the decentralization of the lead pastor. And so many years ago, I thought, hey, I'm the new pastor stepping into my contacts. I've got to do everything. And quite frankly, I had to do everything because nobody was able to do it. So I had to take everything I knew where I wanted to go, and I had to take time and I had to train people. And it took a long time to get there. But nowadays, the pastor is really not the only one that can just do everything. And the pastor shouldn't feel that way, that I have to do everything. I talked to a pastor a couple of months ago. He's like, well, you don't get it. I've got to do everything. I said, no, you don't have to do everything. I said, how many people are in your church? And he told me, and I said, well, there they are right there. You just haven't tapped into them. They would be more than happy to help you get things ready. It's their church too. It's not your church, it's their church. And ultimately it's Jesus's church. And so we want to kind of have this concept of team. And so the shift here is shifting from me to we, from me to we. And so this is a team concept. I heard a long time ago, team stands for together, everyone accomplishes more. Together, everyone accomplishes more. And so as a team, there's a lot we can do together as the church. And so the questions I'm going to challenge you, just as a thought leader here, is how does the priesthood of believers functionally play out and get prioritized in your church system? Like the priesthood of all believers, like they all are commissioned by God to go and share the gospel. So how does that play out in your church? Or do people just come and sit and wonder how they can get plugged in? So I want you to start thinking about the systems in your church and how do you get more people functioning? Another question is basically going back to the whole COVID thing. What is the simplest level of operation needed for church vitality in New England? What COVID did, it simplified and it magnified. Remember how everybody was tuning in on Zoom for just like one thing, and Zoom for small groups, and they were all zoomed out by the end of it? Well, it was all simplified and magnified. And so, it kind of revealed what was concealed. But now we have to think about scalability for sociability for people. People are feeling lonely. There's no longer spaces for people to connect. At least where I'm at, the whole Starbucks concept of third space, first space is home, second space is work, third space is kind of where you hang out. But I'm adding a fourth space. Nobody's talking about this. This is called the digital space, AI, and where people are hanging out online to kind of rebuild their identity through a bot or a chat or something like that. So there's the fourth space. So now we have 4 spaces like in front of our faces, and we're not leveraging them appropriately. And so we've got to think about, people are trying to connect. So how can we connect them? And what do we need to scale down in order to do that? because every member has a role and responsibility for the growth in the local church. Leadership development is key to training up leaders from within. You know, the days of, hey, I'm just going to go look for a new hire and fly them in from like Albuquerque, New Mexico to like New England, and then they stay for 5 years because they realize they can't wear boots and skinny jeans up here, not for too long, and they wind up going back home. You know, the reality is that the truth is we've got to raise up our own leaders from within, and that pipeline has to start with us. So we've got to be intentional about our local church being training centers all across New England. We're going to train people in our contacts. And that's why we have the multiplication center. That's why one of the things we launched, this year was the multiplication center, and we're fine tuning it. And it's going to be an incredible opportunity to get plugged in and to be able to multiply your leaders in doing so. And so leadership development is key. And then also equip and empower people to lead. It takes work from the lead pastor. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be a seminar and a handout. It's going to take raising people up. It's going to take intentional relationships. And so to make those steps, I want you to identify the different individuals or teams currently that are in your church, and how can you equip them more, resource them more, and prepare them to lead more in the church. And then maybe even identify ways that you can just show appreciation to those who are leading. Quitting is pretty crazy right now. People are just kind of coming to church maybe one time a month, 1.5 times. Maybe they come in for the sermon, they miss the music, come in for the sermon, and they dip out before the last song or whatever. I mean, people are not all in all the time. And we're seeing this more and more through the statistics. And so I want you to show appreciation to your people. So take some time, make them feel valued and loved, and write a thank you letter to them. Let them know their hard work is paying off and reaching people. And give them value, because they'll stick if you do that, and they'll appreciate it. It will go a long way. So I want you to do those things. And then the last thing under this, I would say, is just identify the process for recruiting and training new leaders through a leadership pipeline. And so if you don't know how to do that, Logan and I can easily help you with that and kind of help you get started in kind of what that looks like. And we'd love to help you. The next shift is number 7. We got 2 more. Hang in there. I want to leave space for questions. Shift number 7 is rethinking financial sustainability. And so we have to kind of make this big shift from shifting from scarcity mindset to abundance mindset. See, the economic arm right now is a big concern, not just in churches, but in businesses and all across America. And so what's happening is people are entrusting their money to things that they can actually trust and hold on to. And so when you look at your church budget, I want you to think about this. Your economic arm is important, right? Because technically you don't need money to do church, but you need money to have a building and to have, lights and so stuff like that. So if you want a building, you probably want to pay attention to this, or you want a meeting space, you need to pay attention to this. So I want to talk about your budget. So here's the question: is your budget flexible or rigid each year? And so flexible budget is kind of like, okay, well, we can flex, we can shift things around. If it's rigid, like every single thing has a line in space, everything's designated, that's just going to block you. And you're not going to be able to make any decisions. You can't really think for the future. If there's something comes down the pike, you're going to have like 300 meetings to make one small decision that could have been easily made in like 5 minutes. So I want you to think about, flexible or rigid budget, because in Acts 2, when you look at Acts 2, the people, they plugged right into the financial system. It was flexible, right? Whatever they needed. They were a minority. They were not popular. When they decided to follow the way, they were automatically persecuted as if they were leaving Judaism. And so they threw all their resources in. They said, okay, whatever it takes, this is what we're going to do. What do you need? What do you need? And it was that mindset. And so I want you to think, about your financial resources to really leverage those for the community, for vitality, because you have to start asking yourself, where are these resources going to start coming from? Do you know that some churches right now, just across America, they can't even afford to fund maybe a second position in their church? They're struggling. I'm thinking of, particularly like the bivocational pastor who's working really hard week after week and putting in endless hours to make money. And I know of a pastor who takes his paycheck and he pours it into the church so that way the church can function. This has got to be on our radar, because this is where the future is headed. And so we've got to be thinking about different funding streams for the church. This is really, really important. Probably about 10 to 15 years ago, you could probably find, I know you could find his books, but Mark DeMays, pick up any of his books, Disruptions, any of those books. He just wrote a recent book a couple of years ago on the economic status of the church and how they need to be thinking. And he's probably the leading expert in this across America. And so you probably want to start maybe listening to some of his podcasts and some of the stuff he's doing, because really the economic arm is important, because we need to understand our givers. We have to understand, okay, who's showing up and who's giving, who's carrying the church. And I know when you talk about money, people get funny, but the reality is you've got to start looking at this. And so what I want to challenge you to do is I want to help you really find people that are going to attach their cash to something bigger than themselves. People are going to attach their cash to Starbucks, Amazon, but why not your church? Why not to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords? And so what that means is that you have to develop kind of extravagant givers who are going to fund the mission and the vision for the church's impact. And that's going to take some time. And so maybe you need to go through, I mean, could be a whole nother talk, but you really need to look at your giving units in your church, and you need to say, okay, who's actually carrying? Because you might be surprised that maybe it's only 2 people carrying your entire church and everybody else is not really all in. And you're giving leadership positions to these people who are actually robbing the church. And that's really bad management, but that's another conversation. But I want you to really think about developing extravagant givers in your church, people that are all in, people that want to see the church thrive and flourish. And that's going to take some strategic planning and budgeting for growth. These are all things that can happen if you're willing to step into those shifts and make that shift. And so some of the things you can do to step in to that shift is I want you to identify your process and planning for developing extravagant givers. If you don't have one, reach out to me. Okay. Reach out to me. Reach out to Logan. I know for us, we have our givers literally in giving units. So we kind of know like where people sit and what the average person gives in America and what the average person makes in Massachusetts. And we've got this formula that really helps people kind of get on par with what's going on. And so the importance here is, how do you communicate that with importance of biblical stewardship and generosity in your church? Because I think this is really important. Generosity, everybody wants to be generous, but you have to teach people generosity. You have to teach it from all the way from knee high, all the way up to, cane high or whatever, holding a cane or whatever, whatever it is. You got to teach across all generations what giving is, biblical stewardship is. And so I want you to examine those different income streams and then talk about, obedient giving and tithing and stuff like that. All right, here we are. The last shift number 8, rethinking our perspective of the role of the Holy Spirit. So this is, I saved the best for last. So we want to shift from self-dependence to Holy Spirit dependence. See, the church has gotten really comfortable by listening to experts, denominational leaders, and reading tons of books. But here's the thing. What role does prayer and fasting and active involvement, it's sitting at the feet of the Holy Spirit, play in your church? Moving from being comfortable to conformable. Understanding that, okay, I've got to sit at the feet of Jesus and hear what he's saying to the church, to my church in particular. Do I have a listening posture? Does our church have a listening posture to what Jesus is telling us to do in our zip code? This is key. I believe a lot of churches are on autopilot. They just kind of come in, put the lights on, band goes up, whatever, sings a couple of songs, they preach, they go home, whatever. They do this formula. But does your church have a listening posture? Are we hearing from the Holy Spirit of God in our churches? And so if you don't have that, I want you to develop a culture of prayer and fasting in your church. Prayer and fasting for me is a daily routine. It's something I do every day. It's not something I brag about or talk about. It's just part of my life. It's just what I do. And it's part of our church, and our church people and members do that. And so I want to challenge your people in the spiritual disciplines of Bible study and prayer and fasting, hearing from God, making prayer and fasting part of your spiritual journey and community within your church. And so some of the things that you could do to kind of help your church to activate this is start setting up corporate times of prayer and fasting in your church. Maybe there's a fasting guide that you can download and you could just use in your church and just say, hey, for the next, 21 days, next 10 days, whatever it is, we're going to pray and fast over this as a church, and we're going to see God move, and identify the current resources that are available to you at that moment, and pass it out to your church, and let them speak into it, let them be part of what God is doing in and through your church. But you got to regularly communicate the prayer needs, and focus on your revitalization journey. And so this is really important. And so one of the things that we want to do is really help you in that. We want you to be a church of prayer. We want your church to be fasting. We want your church to thrive. I mean, this is all part of what the BC&E is all about. And so that is just really, I'm going to leave room for questions here, and then I'm just going to throw up a couple of things, some freebies for you. But are there any questions? Thanks for being on. I just want to answer any questions. I know it was a lot of information to cover. I could go on for hours about this and a lot of detail, but I just want to open it up.
So Gary, there are a lot of people on that are church leaders and not just pastors. So, what would you say to them? Where's a good place for them to start? Perhaps their pastor's not on here, and they'd like to be a change maker. So, what would you say to them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can't see who's on the chat, so thank you, Sandy, for that.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say, that's, first of all, the question in itself is the right direction. So if you want to do something, find the people who want to make the change in the church, and build a team together, and then come to the pastor and say, hey, not it's a church takeover, but say, hey, we've been really praying about this, and would you give us permission to lead this effort? Some of the things you can do is, I'll just give it to you now, but for everybody in this call, I'm going to give you access to the Church Vitality Network Vault. It's a Vitality Vault, and like I said, it's over 500 resources available to you, and on there is literally, you can get. I'm going to see if I can paste it up in there. Let me see. Yeah, I'll just throw it up. I actually realized I have access to the chat feature. So on there is tons of assessments. There's tons of things that you can download and see. There are prayer guides on there. Claude King has donated a lot of stuff. Jim Randall from Exano has donated a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff in there for you. And so you could go in there, sign up. It's free, and gain some access. And I would just say, just really start with a small group of you guys, and say, hey, we really want to add, church revitalization and vitality to our church. And it's going to start with us. And then then the next thing I would say is reach out to Logan for coaching in there, because, I have people that I coach that are not necessarily the pastors, but they're also some of the lay leaders, and the lay leaders are bringing it to the pastor. And sometimes the pastor's on the call too. He could jump on anytime he wants. And, they're like thumbs up. They're like, hey, thanks so much for this. This is really helping our church. Thanks for pouring into so-and-so, because I don't have the time to pour into them.
Mm-hmm. And also, so out of the 8, would you say, if somebody hasn't started somewhere, which of the 8 do you think would be, or maybe 2 of the 8, would you say would be good places to start?
Okay. I would start immediately with the last one I did.
Okay. Okay.
Sitting at the feet of Jesus and saying, Holy Spirit, what are you saying to us as our church? What do you want us to do? And you're praying and you're fasting, and God will then say, okay, this is what I want you to do. It's kind of like the book of Revelation. This is what I say to churches. And we just have to listen to what God is telling us to do. So that would be one. And then I'd probably do 3, right? The other piece would be the financial piece, for sure. I would start thinking about that, budgeting and where you're putting your money. Cause I think sometimes a lot of churches are wasting money instead of investing it, getting better return of investment. Yep. And then I would say, start with raising up leaders, leadership pipeline stuff. Start gathering a team together and raising those people up, and then launching them out and applauding them as they go out with your permission, pastor's permission and blessing, for sure.
Good. Okay, cool. So you've given them the information about the vault.
Yeah.
And we've also given them, I gave them that, the resource that
Yes.
you had mentioned.
Great. The 30.
Yep, yep. And somebody had asked about the content. It's like some of the questions you've asked in this webinar. Have you written a blog on that somebody can go and get the questions?
I haven't, but that's a great idea.
Okay,
I will do that, but I will also, Sandy, I will get those questions in line and I'll send those over to you, and then we can just
great.
send it out to everybody. That would be
Okay.
great.